Well, hello everyone, welcome to my VIS 2020 talk. My name is Benjamin Kara and I would like to tell you something about insight beyond numbers, which is basically the effect that qualitative considerations can have on the result of a visual analytics application. Well, as you know, most of us use the term insight pretty frequently to describe what is the outcome of applying our visualizations and what kind of results can be obtained in visual analytics using one of our applications. However, what I would like to point out is that sometimes the quantitative approach, which is currently predominant in data analytics and therefore also in visual analytics, is not enough to describe every kind of insight that might be obtained from a visualization. I would like to show an example in a few minutes, but first I would like to go a little bit deeper into what kinds of insight we can actually obtain from visualization. So in the literature you will find a number of user studies that tells you that there are essentially three categories of insight we can obtain from visualization. The first one is insight into the visualization itself. This is the kind of insight you obtain from your visual literacy and from studying the legends and the scales that are provided along with the visualization, and it basically tells you how to read the visualization. The next kind is insight into the data. This category of insight tells you something about the data and is obtained by reading of the values, so you apply your knowledge how to read the visualization to learn something about the data. To this end, you have to align your readings about the data, for example, the height of a bar chart, to what you know about the visualization, for example, the scale that is aligned with the height. And this alignment operation causes a higher cognitive load than just reading off values, and therefore is harder to perform than obtaining insight into the visualization. The third category also requires you to align this knowledge to knowledge that is not part of the visualization, mainly domain knowledge which is present in the user's mind, which is present in textbooks or whatever, but is not part of the data and is not part of a visualization. This kind of insight into the domain is what actually allows you to draw conclusions about the domain from what you have learned about the data before. However, since it involves knowledge that is not part of the visualization, or is usually not part of the visualization, but is definitely not part of the data, this is the hardest kind of insight to obtain. So most visualizations, basically by the quantitative approach, which is predominant today, are stuck with insight into the data, basically because they do not show additional knowledge that is not part of the domain of the data but is important for the domain. Let me show you an example in this regard. Here you see a bar chart. Let's first obtain some insight about this visualization. So it's a bar chart that has a scale ranging from 0 to about 7,000 and has months on the x-axis. So basically it's a bar chart telling us that there are some numbers that evolve from around March to around June in some year. And there's a global trend saying that this data, that the numbers first climbed and then they went down again. However, as you also see, there's some kind of pattern here, which is a more local pattern. So we have those local ups and downs. And the question is, what does this tell us about the data? We can already learn something about the data. So we already observed two patterns. And this local pattern says that the data is in intervals rising and then falling again. Okay, so the main question to obtain insight into the domain would be, what is this visualization? What is this bar chart actually about? So I tell you that these are the positive COVID-19 tests per day in Germany from March to June 2020, according to the Robert Koch Institute, which is the German federal government agency for disease control. So the question now is this pattern, which is shown in purple here, is this pattern actually relevant for the domain? It basically implies that there's a number of small waves when people get infected, and then there are days when less people get infected again. And the question is, where does this come from? Is this important for the domain, or is this probably just some artifact in the data? And the answer is actually it's none of both. So it's not important for the domain and it's not a data artifact. Let me explain why. The red arrows I just blended in show you where the weekends are. So what you see here is that the decline is always during the weekends. Also, there's a bunch of holidays in Germany in May, so there is a larger decrease visible in May on the weekends and especially on continuing holidays. So the point here is that basically domain knowledge tells us that the real reason why there is this decline in the numbers is that many of the laboratories that are making the tests, so the laboratories are not working on the weekend, they are closed. So basically less tests are performed during the weekends than on weekdays. So essentially by this knowledge we see that the decline we see in the intervals is not important for the domain. And this also cannot be read from the data because it is not included in the data when the laboratories are actually open and when they process the results. So basically we can only find out that this pattern is not important and not relevant for the domain from including outside knowledge. And what we know from this outside knowledge is that only this global pattern that we had a rise in March and then it fell down until the end of June is relevant for the domain. So what does this tell us? Well, basically this tells us that the quantitative approach, again I want to pronounce that it is not in the data that the weekends, that the laboratories are closed at the weekends. So basically we see that not all observations, not all findings we can make in the data are automatically relevant for the domain. In this case it was not even a valid observation. The point here is that we need to see this, that to see whether an observation is relevant or even valid for the domain, we need to include additional levels of context. We cannot rely on the data because this information is not part of the data. And therefore we say that we need an additional perspective that broadens our scope of discussion and extends this from the quantitative level, which is predominant today, mainly focusing on the data and quantitative operations, automatic analysis and such. And we need to extend this to include those additional levels of context. And what we call this is qualitative visual analysis, which is basically asking you to point out how exactly insights are meant to be obtained during visual analytics. And we invite you to follow us and to apply these qualitative visual analysis, which we mean is to incorporate in your papers more discussions on how exactly the insights are meant to be obtained. What kind of domain knowledge is necessary to understand your visualization? How exactly are the users proposed to obtain insights? What are the reasoning strategies applied? And it really starts with some it really starts low level with discussing proper scaling according to the domain. It discusses with discussion of the influence of units, and then it goes on until you really discuss reasoning strategies applied. As I said in our paper, we have about 13 examples where qualitative considerations can enhance the presentation, can enhance the results that you obtain by the currently predominant purely quantitative approach. So I really invite you to embrace the qualitative factors contributing to the visualization result and to discuss them explicitly in your papers. So what's in for you? Well, for visualization researchers, the point is that discussing and understanding how insight actually emerged from visualization, we may be able in the future to obtain a better understanding of what we actually do in terms of what kinds of interactions, for example, can we provide that really support our users in better gaining insights and gaining evaluating their insights against the domain. And for application scientists, they might be able with this additional knowledge to get a closer connection between the visualization and the domain by incorporating the right domain knowledge at the right time to optimally support their users. So with this, I'd like to close my presentation here, and I would really like to invite you to get in touch with us and to discuss terms more via email or via any other means of communication. Feel free to get in touch with us and discuss Insight Beyond Numbers. Thank you.